She loved my cousin, but told me I was broken. I thought she was just mean, until she revealed she hoped for my death, and explained why. Growing up, I always felt like I was walking on thin ice around my grandmother. While my cousin Trevor got the royal treatment, brand new toys at every visit, homemade cookies just for him, endless hugs and kisses, I got the cold shoulder and harsh words. She'd look at me with this expression that I can only describe as disappointment mixed with disgust, like I was some kind of failed experiment. I remember being 7 years old, watching Trevor unwrap yet another expensive gift while I sat empty-handed on the couch. My grandmother would shower him with praise for the smallest things, tying his shoes, finishing his vegetables, even just sitting quietly. But when I did the same things, she'd either ignore me completely or find something wrong with how I did it. She'd tell my parents I was strange and lifeless, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made her uncomfortable. The worst part was how she'd say these things right in front of me, like I wasn't even there. She'd whisper to my mom about how I was not quite right, and how she worried about my future. I started believing her. I began to think maybe I really was broken somehow, that there was some invisible flaw in me that everyone could see except me. When I turned 8, things got worse. My grandmother started making these comments about how I was taking up space, and how some children were meant to be while others were mistakes. She'd say I was too quiet, too withdrawn, that I didn't have the spark that real children had. Meanwhile, Trevor could do no wrong in her eyes. He was loud, energetic, everything she said I wasn't. I started spending more time in my room, avoiding family gatherings where I knew I'd have to watch this painful display of favoritism. My parents noticed but didn't seem to know how to handle it. They'd give me weak smiles and tell me my grandmother was just set in her ways, but I could see the concern in their eyes too. By the time I was 10, I had completely withdrawn from trying to win her approval. What was the point? I'd watch other kids with their grandparents at school events, seeing the normal love and affection, and I'd feel this hollow ache in my chest. I convinced myself I didn't need her validation, but deep down, it ate away at me every single day. The summer I turned 12 changed everything in the worst possible way. I was staying at my grandmother's house for a week while my parents were out of town. She had Trevor over too, of course, and I spent most of my time reading in the guest room while they bonded downstairs. One evening, I went to the kitchen to get some water and heard my grandmother talking to my mom on the phone. What I heard made my blood run cold. She was saying how worried she was about me, how I wasn't like other children. But then she said something that made me freeze completely. He's not alive inside. There's nothing there. He's not real. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. She continued talking about how she could see it in my eyes, how I was hollow and empty, how it made her skin crawl to look at me. I crept back to my room in a daze, those words echoing in my head. Not real. Not alive inside. I stared at myself in the mirror for hours that night, trying to see what she saw, trying to understand what was wrong with me that made her hate me so much. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of her words. The next few years were a blur of me trying to prove I was real and alive. I threw myself into activities, tried to be more outgoing, forced smiles and laughter even when I felt dead inside. But nothing worked. My grandmother's coldness toward me only seemed to intensify as I got older. She'd make comments about how I was wasting everyone's time, and how some people were born wrong. When I turned 16, I stopped trying altogether. I accepted that I would never understand why she hated me, and I focused on getting through high school so I could leave and never look back. I made friends who actually seemed to like me, had teachers who encouraged me, and slowly started to believe that maybe my grandmother was the problem, not me. But I still carried those words with me everywhere I went. Not alive inside. Not real. They haunted my dreams and crept into my thoughts during quiet moments. I started to wonder if other people could see whatever she saw in me, if I was fooling everyone else but she could see the truth. Update 1. I thought I had figured out how to live with my grandmother's hatred, but I was wrong. Everything came crashing down when I turned 18, and it happened in the most public, humiliating way possible. It was my birthday dinner, and my whole family was there, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone. We were at this nice restaurant downtown, the kind of place where people speak in hushed tones and everything costs more than it should. I was actually having a good time for once, laughing with my cousins and feeling like maybe I could finally put all the childhood trauma behind me. My grandmother had been drinking wine throughout the dinner, which was unusual for her. She usually nursed one glass all evening, but she was on her third or fourth. I should have seen the warning signs, should have known something was building up inside her. She kept staring at me across the table with this intense look, like she was working up the courage to say something. The moment came when my mom stood up to make a toast for my birthday. Everyone was smiling, raising their glasses, and I was actually feeling emotional about how normal and happy everything felt. Then my grandmother stood up too, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her voice cut through the celebration like a knife. She said I should have died before I was born, that there was supposed to be another child instead of me. The entire restaurant seemed to go quiet. I could feel the eyes of strangers on our table as my grandmother's voice got louder and more slurred. She told everyone at the table that I had been a twin, that my brother hadn't survived, and that she had prayed every night that I would follow him. She said I had stolen his place, that I was the wrong child who lived. The words hit me like physical blows, each one making it harder to breathe. My mom started crying immediately. My dad looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. My cousins were staring at their plates, and Trevor looked genuinely shocked for the first time in his life. But my grandmother wasn't done. She said she could see it in me from the moment I was born, that I was incomplete, that I was living a life that belonged to someone else. I don't remember getting up from the table or leaving the restaurant. I just remember walking through the city streets in a daze, replaying her words over and over in my head. The revelation about having a twin brother explained so much about why she hated me, but it also made everything so much worse. I wasn't just unwanted. I was a constant reminder of a child she had actually loved and lost. I walked for hours that night, trying to process the fact that my entire existence had been built on this foundation of resentment and loss. Every cold look, every harsh word, every moment of favoritism toward Trevor suddenly made sense. I wasn't just the grandchild who disappointed her. I was the living symbol of her grief and the death of her hopes. When I finally made it home, my parents were waiting up for me. My mom's eyes were red from crying, and my dad looked older than I'd ever seen him. They tried to explain that they had planned to tell me about my twin when I was older, that they thought it would be too painful for me to know. They said my grandmother had been devastated when my brother died and had never recovered from the loss. But none of their explanations could take away the poison she had poured into my ears that night. The knowledge that she had spent 18 years looking at me and wishing I was dead, that every birthday and holiday had been a reminder of her disappointment, was too much to bear. I spent the next few weeks in a dark place, questioning everything about my identity and my right to exist. If I was supposed to die, if I had taken someone else's place, what did that make me? Was I living a borrowed life? Did I have any right to happiness or success when it should have belonged to my brother? The worst part was realizing that all those years of trying to win her approval had been pointless. There was nothing I could have done to change her mind because I wasn't the child she wanted. I was the consolation prize, the survivor who reminded her daily of what she had lost. I started having dreams about this phantom brother, imagining what he would have been like, what kind of relationship he would have had with our grandmother. In my dreams, he was everything I wasn't: confident, charismatic, alive in all the ways she said I was dead. I would wake up feeling guilty for existing, for taking up space in a world where he should have been. Update 2. The months following that disastrous birthday dinner were the darkest of my life, but they also led to the most unexpected discovery about my family's secrets. I had been avoiding family gatherings completely, ignoring calls from relatives, and basically trying to disappear from everyone's lives. My parents were walking on eggshells around me, clearly feeling guilty about keeping the twin secret for so long. It was my aunt who finally broke the silence that had settled over our family like a thick fog. She showed up at my apartment one evening with a box of old photographs and documents, saying there were things I needed to know that my grandmother had forbidden the family from discussing. My hand shook as I opened that box, not knowing if I was ready for more revelations that would turn my world upside down again. The first photograph I saw made my breath catch in my throat. It was my grandmother as a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, holding 2 babies. But these weren't me and my deceased twin brother. These were 2 other children, both very much alive in the photo. My aunt's voice was gentle as she explained that my grandmother had lost twins of her own, decades before I was born. The story that unfolded was tragic and complicated. My grandmother's first pregnancy had resulted in twin boys, but one had died shortly after birth from complications. She had become obsessed with the surviving twin, pouring all her love and grief into raising him. But when he was 3 years old, he had contracted a severe illness and died as well. My grandmother had blamed herself for not being able to save either child. My aunt showed me more photographs, letters, and medical records that painted a picture of a woman consumed by guilt and loss. After losing her twins, my grandmother had struggled with severe depression and had several miscarriages before finally having my father. She had been terrified throughout that pregnancy, convinced that she was cursed and that any child she brought into the world was doomed. But the revelation that hit me hardest was learning that my deceased twin brother had been born with the same rare medical condition that had killed my grandmother's first set of twins. The doctors had explained to my parents that it was genetic, that there was nothing anyone could have done to save him. My grandmother, however, had seen it as confirmation of her curse, proof that history was repeating itself in the cruelest possible way. My aunt explained that when I was born healthy and strong, my grandmother had been unable to accept it. In her mind, I should have been the one to die, not my brother. She had convinced herself that I had somehow stolen his strength, that my survival was unnatural and wrong. Her hatred of me wasn't just about losing a grandchild she might have loved. It was about her own unresolved trauma and guilt stretching back decades. The photographs in the box showed a different side of my grandmother, one I had never seen. There were pictures of her laughing, playing with children, looking genuinely happy. But there were also darker images, photos where her eyes looked hollow and distant, where she seemed to be staring through the camera rather than at it. I could see the progression of her grief and how it had hardened her heart over the years. Learning about my grandmother's own loss didn't excuse her treatment of me, but it helped me understand it in a way that was both heartbreaking and liberating. She hadn't hated me because I was fundamentally flawed or unworthy of love. She had hated me because I represented everything she had lost and couldn't get back, because my existence forced her to confront her own failures and regrets. My aunt also revealed that other family members had tried to intervene over the years, that there had been arguments and confrontations about how my grandmother treated me. But she had been so determined in her belief that I was somehow wrong or cursed that she had refused to listen to anyone. She had created this narrative in her mind where I was the villain in her story of loss, and nothing could shake her from it. As I sat surrounded by these photographs and documents, I felt something shifting inside me. The weight of her words, the years of believing I was fundamentally broken, began to lift slightly. I wasn't the problem, her unhealed trauma was. I wasn't living a borrowed life. I was living the only life I had ever known, the one I had fought to keep despite everything. But even with this new understanding, I struggled with what to do next. How do you forgive someone who spent decades wishing you dead? How do you rebuild your sense of self after learning that your existence was seen as a cosmic mistake by someone who should have loved you unconditionally? The answer came to me gradually, not in some dramatic moment of clarity, but in small realizations over the following weeks. I started to see my survival not as a theft from my brother, but as a gift I needed to honor. If I had been given this life against all odds, against my grandmother's wishes and expectations, then I owed it to myself and to my brother's memory to live it fully. Final update. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it started with a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. Instead of cutting my grandmother out of my life completely, I decided to visit her one last time. Not to confront her or seek an apology I knew would never come, but to say goodbye to the version of myself that had spent so many years seeking her approval. I found her in her garden on a quiet Sunday morning, tending to the roses she had always loved more than she had ever loved me. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, and for the first time I could see the weight of her own grief in the way she moved. When she saw me approaching, her face hardened into that familiar expression of disapproval, but there was something different in her eyes, maybe fear, maybe regret. I didn't try to hug her or force any kind of emotional reconciliation. Instead, I simply told her that I understood now why she had never been able to love me, that I knew about her lost twins and the pain she had carried for so many years. Her hand stilled on the roses, and for a moment she looked like she might cry. But then her walls went back up, and she turned away from me without saying a word. That was okay. I hadn't come for her words or her tears. I had come to tell her that despite everything she had done to convince me otherwise, I was glad to be alive. I told her about the friends who cared about me, the dreams I was chasing, the simple joys I had discovered in just being myself. I told her that I was no longer going to carry her guilt or live in the shadow of a brother I had never known. The strangest part was that as I spoke, I felt genuinely sorry for her. Not the kind of pity that comes from superiority, but the deep sadness that comes from recognizing another person's pain. She had spent decades poisoning her own heart with resentment and loss, missing out on the chance to know the grandchild who was right there in front of her. Her hatred had hurt me, but it had destroyed her. When I left her garden that day, I knew it would be the last time I would see her. Not because I was cutting her off in anger, but because I was finally free to walk away from a relationship that had never served either of us. I had spent so many years trying to prove my worth to someone who was incapable of seeing it, and I was done wasting that energy. The months that followed were like learning to breathe properly for the first time. I threw myself into living with an intensity that surprised everyone around me. I traveled to places I had always wanted to see, took up hobbies I had been too self-conscious to try, and started building relationships with people who actually wanted me in their lives. I also started volunteering with children who had lost parents or siblings, finding a strange kind of healing in helping others navigate grief and loss. Working with these kids taught me that survival isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something to celebrate and honor. Every day I got to wake up and choose how to spend my time was a gift, not a theft from someone else. Trevor and I actually started talking again, really talking, for the first time since we were kids. It turned out he had always felt uncomfortable with our grandmother's favoritism, but he hadn't known how to address it without losing the only grandparent relationship he had ever known. We both realized we had been trapped in roles she had assigned us, and we were both ready to write our own stories. My parents and I had some difficult conversations about the secrets they had kept and the ways they had failed to protect me from our grandmother's cruelty. It wasn't easy, but we all agreed that pretending nothing had happened wasn't helping anyone. They started going to counseling to work through their own guilt, and slowly we began rebuilding our relationship on more honest ground. The most unexpected change was in how I started thinking about my twin brother. Instead of seeing him as the perfect child I could never measure up to, I began imagining him as my biggest supporter, someone who would have wanted me to live boldly and joyfully. I started living not in competition with his memory, but in partnership with it. I got a tattoo on my 18th birthday, not some dramatic statement, just a small symbol that reminded me of resilience and survival. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that I had made it through the worst of my grandmother's hatred and come out stronger on the other side. My grandmother passed away 2 years later. I went to her funeral, not to mourn the relationship we never had, but to say a final goodbye to the pain she had carried and passed on to others. I felt sad for her, for the woman who had been so consumed by loss that she couldn't see the life blooming right in front of her. But I also felt free. Standing at her graveside, I realized that her opinion of me had never actually mattered. The voice that had lived in my head for so many years, telling me I was broken and unwanted, was finally quiet. In its place was something I had never expected to find: genuine love for myself and excitement about the future I was building. I'm 25 now, and my life is nothing like what my grandmother predicted for me. I'm not hollow or empty or lifeless. I'm loud and messy and full of contradictions, and I love every imperfect piece of who I've become. I have people in my life who see me clearly and choose to love me anyway. I have dreams that feel achievable and failures that don't destroy me. Sometimes I wonder what my brother would think of the man I'd become, but I no longer torture myself with those thoughts. I choose to believe he would be proud of how hard I've fought to claim my place in this world, how I've turned our grandmother's curse into my own kind of blessing. I'm living now, not just surviving, but truly living, in full color and with complete permission to take up space. Every breath feels like a small victory over the forces that tried to convince me I didn't belong here. And maybe that's the most beautiful revenge of all: becoming exactly who I was meant to be, despite everyone who said I wasn't supposed to exist at all.